The year was 2000. With the chaos of the 90s and shock therapy behind them, the Russian economy was in high gear. Riding a wave of record-high oil and gas prices, by the end of the decade, Russia's GDP would grow fivefold. By 2013, the Russian economy was nearly 9 times greater than at the turn of the millennium. But then, in February of 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. The wave of record-high energy prices crashed and inflowed a raft of Western sanctions. What would follow would be a lost decade. Fast forward to 2023, and the 10x growth multiple had been replaced by a 10%. The Russian GDP in 2023 was 10% lower than it was in 2013. Far away in South America, Brazil, the B in BRICS, also witnessed an economic boom, ending the first decade of the new millennium with a GDP over 3 times higher than at the start. During the Lula years, the money that was sprinkled throughout society fueled domestic consumption, which along with the record-high commodity prices, helped Brazil's economy surge. But, as if following in Russia's footsteps, the Brazilian GDP plummeted after the commodity shock of 2014. The economic miracle, replaced with tales of corruption, scandal, and political instability. Let's explore what Russia and Brazil's GDP growth could have been if they had continued growing, an alternative history, one without war, less scandal, and most importantly, less dependency on commodity exports. To do so, we will compare Brazil and Russia with 3 reference groups that have comparable GDPs and economic conditions in order to calculate a hypothetical 2023 GDP for Russia and Brazil. The period from 2014 to 2023 was a difficult time for many countries, but some fared better than others, and a small few captured tremendous gains. We'll also explore the other BRICS countries and the European Union and see how they fared in the last decade when compared with the US. As a disclaimer, I'm not an economist, and this is merely a simple macro-level analysis done for curiosity and information purposes only and should not be considered as financial advice. To gain more context, let's examine the GDP trajectories of 3 reference groups, the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, Mexico, and the big 3 Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. Each group has a 2023 GDP of around $2 trillion, similar to both Russia and Brazil. With respect to Russia, the Warsaw Pact group captures the economic starting conditions for a developing country in the decades after the Soviet collapse. Unlike Russia and Brazil, this group has very low reliance on commodity exports and much lower levels of corruption. For Mexico, its level of corruption is comparable to both Russia and Brazil. Mexico is a major oil producer, similar to Russia and Brazil, and further, like Brazil, it is also a major exporter of agricultural products. Although smaller than Brazil's population of 215 million, Mexico's population of 129 million people is very close to Russia's population of 144 million. And finally, the Gulf State group captures the economic conditions of a petrostate during a time of low energy prices. We will use the economic performance from 2014 to 2023 of these reference groups in order to calculate an adjusted GDP projection for Russia and Brazil during this time period. Here we have a combined GDP graph for the former Warsaw Pact countries. They also experienced an economic contraction after 2014, but to a smaller degree. Using the linear regression from the years 2000 to 2013, we can see how much this group deviated from its projected GDP growth. For reference, we calculate the percent error, the difference between the actual GDP minus the projected GDP, and with respect to, divided by, the projected GDP. We will use this percent error later to calculate our adjusted projected GDPs for Russia and Brazil. We can then total up this error and arrive at the cumulative error for the decade. For this group, the cumulative error was negative 209%, much lower than the negative 445 and negative 449% for Russia and Brazil, respectively. We can also calculate the total deviation from the projected GDP by totaling up the difference between the actual GDP and the projected GDP in each year. This could be viewed as a measure of the economic loss in absolute dollar terms due to the reduced growth relative to the projection. For the Warsaw Pact, this total deviation was negative 3.7 trillion. For Russia and Brazil, their total deviation was negative 14.2 and negative 16.5 trillion, respectively. Next, we have the GDP graph from Mexico, along with the percent error values. We again find a similar pattern of decreased GDP growth and a cumulative percent error amounting to negative 143%. Finally, we have the combined GDP graph for the Gulf states and the corresponding percent error values. For this group, the cumulative percent error was negative 195%. Despite these 3 reference groups existing on 3 separate continents, and despite their differences in economic structure, the percent error ranges are relatively similar and range from 143 to 207%. The average total deviation from the 2000 to 2013 linear projection is negative 2.8 trillion. We can also examine the slope values from the linear equation. This is the growth rate. We can see that over 2000 to 2013, Russia and Brazil had a growth rate around 2 times greater than the Warsaw Pact and Gulf reference groups, and a growth rate over 4 times greater than Mexico. We will revisit this later. Although high growth rates are generally good, they can also signal for potential instability, especially in economies that are highly dependent on commodity exports or are over-leveraged on debt. Next, we'll calculate our adjusted projected GDPs for Russia and Brazil by using this percent error factor from the reference groups. We will take this percent error value and apply it as a correction factor on a yearly basis to the Russian and Brazilian projected GDPs from the 2000 to 2013 linear regression. This gives us the adjusted projected GDP with error from the given reference group. This step will help to normalize the economic impact that resulted from the global economic conditions over the last decade. Here is a visual representation of the adjustment using the Warsaw Pact percent error. The light blue points are the adjusted projected GDP with error using the WP reference group. They reflect a decrease in Russia's projected GDP relative to the actual Warsaw Pact GDP data from 2014 to 2023. We can then calculate the deviation between the actual Russian GDP and this new projection for the past decade. We see that the total deviation in the Russian GDP amounts to negative $7.8 trillion, much smaller than the 14 trillion observed when using the simple regression analysis alone. The projected 2023 GDP for Russia using this method was 3.6 trillion compared to Russia's actual 2023 GDP of 2 trillion. When using Mexico as a reference group, we find this result. The total deviation in Russian GDP from this projection is negative $9.7 trillion from 2014 to 2023 and yields a projected 2023 GDP of 4 trillion for Russia. And then again with the Gulf reference group, here the total deviation is negative 8 trillion with a projected Russian GDP of 3.2 trillion. And then we do the same for Brazil. For the Warsaw Pact adjustment, we find a total deviation of negative 9.4 trillion and a projected Brazilian 2023 GDP of 4 trillion US dollars. Using the percent error from Mexico, we find a total deviation of a negative 11.5 trillion and a projected GDP of 4.5 trillion. Finally, using the Gulf reference group, we arrive at a total deviation of negative 9.5 trillion and a projected Brazilian GDP of 3.6 trillion. The adjusted projected GDPs are summarized here. We can note that they are generally quite consistent despite the appreciable differences in economic composition between the reference groups. This correction factor reduces the total deviations by around 40%. Projected 2023 GDPs are about 2 times higher than the actual GDPs for Russia and Brazil, but are much lower than those predicted by Russia and Brazil's linear regressions alone. Finally, to make the models more conservative, we will calculate the projected GDPs from 2014 to 2023 using the slope or growth rate from Mexico rather than using the data from the target country. Of the reference groups, Mexico had the lowest growth rate of 44.5 billion per year, and then on top of that slope correction, we will apply the Mexican percent error correction just as we did in the previous model. Here we can see that applying both the Mexican growth rate and the percent error, we arrive at a smaller deviation amounting to negative $4.5 trillion for Russia. This assumes that during the period from 2014 to 2023, Russia would have experienced a slowdown in growth similar to Mexico. Additionally, we have the applied percent error correction from the Mexico reference group to account for the general low economic growth during this period. And then we do the same for Brazil, yielding a total deviation of negative 4 trillion. These models are summarized here. We find that the Mexican slope plus Mexican percent error method is the most conservative and yields projected 2023 GDPs for Russia and Brazil of 2.8 trillion and 2.9 trillion respectively. This is around 40% higher than the actual Russian and Brazilian GDPs. If Russia and Brazil had kept growing, it's likely they would have reached a GDP of 3 trillion, approaching countries in the global top 7 like France, the UK, and India. But of course, that isn't what happened. For Russia, growth was reduced significantly by the barrage of Western sanctions, first after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and then even more so after the second invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Russia's high dependency on energy exports provided additional vulnerabilities, and the commodity crash of 2014 to 2020 further tanked Russia's actual GDP growth. It's impossible to estimate the total cost to the Russian GDP over the last decade, but it most likely numbers in the trillions of dollars. For Brazil, there are of course no Western sanctions or war expenditures, but there is the powerful warning of over-reliance on commodity exports. This easy source of cash can power rapid economic growth, but that growth can come crashing right down. Brazil, as well as Russia, have high levels of corruption. This creates further vulnerabilities, especially in countries with vast natural resources. During the good times, the political elites will siphon off the nation's wealth rather than invest it back into the country, foregoing domestic investments and diversification initiatives, keeping the country forever plagued by the natural resource curse. Brazil provides an additional warning, that of excessive reliance on government spending. Government spending accounts for over 40% of Brazil's GDP, much higher when compared with Mexico's 25 to 30%. Government spending as a percent of GDP in Brazil is similar to the much wealthier European-style social democracies in the European Union. We'll see next how the EU fared over the last decade. When public sector spending is used to increase GDP, there is the risk of parasitizing the wealth-generating, productive private sector. For the rapidly aging welfare states of the European Union, the last decade of economic data indicates they have lost their way and their competitiveness. The total deviation for the last decade from the growth projected by the 2000 to 2013 linear regression is a staggering negative $52 trillion of lost economic potential. In contrast, the U.S. exceeded its growth projection by $22 trillion, China by nearly $18 trillion, and India by $1.3 trillion. Somewhat ominously, the total from the U.S., China, and India amounts to $41 trillion, almost balancing Europe's losses. When we examine the BRICS countries, it suggests the ultimate risk of over-relying on natural resources at the expense of industrial development, manufacturing, and economic diversification. During times of low commodity prices, the countries with high reliance on commodity exports, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa, have their GDPs figuratively or literally consumed by those countries with more productive manufacturing and industrial sectors. In the case of BRICS, those being China and India. The stark difference over the decade between these countries is telling. Beware the trap of natural resources.